I'd like to introduce Jessica Brown now. Jessica is a policy analyst at the Centre for Independent Studies in Australia. It's one of that country's leading public policy think tanks. And I have to say it's very nice to see a fresh young person involved in this really important field. So we wish you great success in it, Jessica. Jessica's research at the CIS focuses on family policy and government payments to families, welfare payments and welfare reform. She's published extensively on the topics of paid parental leave, jobless families, welfare to work and disability benefits, and she comments regularly in the media on family welfare and social policy issues. And I would just like to commend to you her paper, which is on the website. I came across this as part of my research, and it's a terrific piece of work. It's not only very interesting, but it's actually very readable, which is something is quite refreshing in this world, I think. So welcome, Jessica, and we look forward to hearing from you.
Thank you. Can you hear me? It's a bit daunting to follow such a few big names this morning, and I have to apologise. Some of the themes that I touch on are quite similar to what Bob Gregory touched on as well, although I don't think I'll be able to do justice to the way he described it, but I'll give it a go. Today I'd like to focus on Australia's experience with disability support pension and what lessons New Zealand might be able to take from this experience. There's a growing consensus among governments around the developed world about the need to reduce the number of people relying on disability benefits, and this is where my research cuts in. This slide, I'm just going to deviate from my script a bit here. This slide might seem pretty self-explanatory to everyone in this room. The reason I put it in is because when I speak to people who aren't involved in this area about what I'm doing, they say, what's the problem? You know, you have a disability and you get a benefit, or you don't and you don't get it, so what's the issue? And I think, as everyone here knows, it's a lot more complicated than that. And the area of disability benefit reform really focuses on this middle group, and that's the difficulty. So the challenge for governments is really to, in Australia, New Zealand and all around the world, is to develop a system of disability benefits that effectively excludes the group with no disability or with very mild disabilities who are able to work and support themselves, provides an adequate safety net for those people with very serious disabilities who might not be able to support themselves, and at the same time provides support for the middle group without undermining their incentive to work, and that's the real challenge. The number of disability support pensioners, and that's the main payment for people with disabilities in Australia, has tripled from about 250,000 in the mid-1980s to 770,000 today. During this time, the proportion of people, the proportion of working age people on DSP also doubled from 2.5% to 5%. So we know that it's not just population growth that's driving this change. In New Zealand, a very similar pattern between 2000 and now, an increase from 3.5% to 4.5%. I'm not going to talk about that. Oh, and excuse my typo at the top that's supposed to say invalids benefit. I'll leave that to Michael to talk about that in more detail and jump straight into it. Okay, Australia underwent a major reform of its welfare system during the 1990s, shifting from passive welfare to a focus on mutual obligation. The reforms first targeted the unemployed, and together with very strong economic growth, resulted in a big drop in unemployment. In the mid-2000s, the Howard government turned their attention to disability pensioners. The cut-off point for DSP was changed, and any new applicant who could work 15 hours a week was placed on unemployment benefits and required to seek part-time work. Previously, the cut-off had been 30 hours a week. In 2009, the Rudd government announced that they would further tighten eligibility procedures. And in last month's budget, they announced another crackdown. All new applicants will now have to prove that they are unable to work and undergo training to be reskilled in a different job. These reforms came about both as a result of a few lessons that Australian policymakers had learned about DSP, and in turn the reforms have taught us some more things about why DSP continues to grow and how governments and policymakers can possibly stop that growth. The first thing we learned is that there is a very clear relationship between DSP and unemployment, although it's not linear. Studies have found that much of the growth in DSP has been driven by rising unemployment, and this harks back to what Bob Gregory was talking about earlier. And in Australia, after the financial crisis hit, we saw a 23% jump in the number of people applying for DSP within a 10-month period. This slide shows the year-on-year increase in the number of people going on to DSP. The red bars indicate years there was an upswing in unemployment, so it coincides with recessions basically. As you can see, there's quite a clear relationship between the two. The reason we think that DSP goes up when unemployment goes up is that people with disabilities, on average, have lower levels of education. I believe in Australia about half have less than high school education, and also often have more complex needs, sometimes need flexible work, which means are often more susceptible to unemployment when recessions hit. When there are fewer jobs around, the incentive to go on to DSP grows, and this is as Bob Gregory was talking about earlier. And as we know from what we've learned, this means once people are on DSP, the chances of ever going back to the workforce are much less. The second thing we've learned is that welfare reforms can lead to a perverse incentive to go on to DSP. And again, this is very much around the same sort of theme that Bob Gregory talked about earlier.